My name is Lori Power. My company is MP Benefits, and I'm a group benefit consultant. My purpose each week is to engage in real conversation with real people to grow and learn and connect. We all get better through open conversation. Nicole and I have been friends for a number of years now. We're group groovy gals. We like to share and get together on how we do business and how we can do business better. Nicole, if you can take a quick moment and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Lori. Really appreciate being here. And thank you to see all these friendly faces this morning. My name is Nicole Ardiel, and I'm a benefits advisor in Victoria with a passion for a lot of things, a long list that I won't go into. I also just want to take a moment to say we are in very esteemed company here. Lori has just won the 2022 Excellence in Benefits Award, which is amazing. So Lori, thank you so much. You're such an inspiration to me, and I'm so pleased to be here this morning.
Thank you very much. That's you would think that I had primed her for that. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. I am thrilled to have that. Lisa had said that last week as well, and I really, really appreciate it. It is an honor. It feels like, you're standing in front of the Oscars going, I was just happy to be nominated, but truly I was. Dan, can you take a moment and introduce yourself as well?
Well, I too am honored to be part of this esteemed group. So my name is Dan Ekstrand. I deal with everything as it relates to patient access for Western Canada. A little bit of backdrop and history for you in terms of Novo Nordisk. We are the world's largest innovators in terms of chronic disease, particularly in the space of diabetes and obesity. And a little bit of a unique feature you may or may not know about our organization, we're actually owned by a foundation. So it's the world's largest foundation, 50% larger than the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which allows us to have a more forward-thinking lens. And also we have a responsibility and commitment to do societal benefit. So it covers a whole range of issues. For instance, we're based in Denmark. So when COVID hit, the Novo Nordisk Foundation was responsible for the COVID tracing. So it covers a whole number of different health issues, but I'm very honored to be part of this conversation, an important conversation.
It is an important conversation. Today, we're talking about the realities of obesity. We're going to talk about the realities of our own bias. That fills me up. I got to be honest. Take it away, Nicole.
Okay, sure, Lori. I honestly, every time I see that video, it gives me chills. It is so powerful. And it really, I said to Lori before we even opened, we could just play that video and say, okay, you all know now, we'll see you next week. But of course, we do have a little bit more to talk about. Again, thank you so much, Lori, for the opportunity to be here this morning. I'll give a little bit of background about why I am here right now today and why I'm talking about this. I am an employee benefits advisor in the insurance industry, and I have been doing this now for a quarter of a century, which seems unbelievable. And way back when I started, there was this term called lifestyle drugs. Now, for those of you not in the insurance industry, what this is a term that is generally used by the insurance industry to describe a body of drugs that cover things like anti-obesity medication, fertility medication, smoking cessation, and erectile dysfunction medication. This term has existed for a long time, and it has always bothered me, but it wasn't until December of 2020 that I was listening to a virtual drug conference, and someone was speaking about obesity, and the word lifestyle drugs came up. And it really hit me how wrong that term was. Obesity is not a lifestyle choice, nor is erectile dysfunction, nor is infertility, nor is being addicted to nicotine. Weight is not a behavior. Obesity is not a lifestyle choice. That light bulb, for lack of a better term, that went off at that particular point led me to meet with Dan. And I have to say, I would not be going down this journey without Dan. I probably would have gone, yeah, that really bothers me that we're using that term. What can we do about it? I don't really know. Ended up meeting with Dan, and Dan introduced me to a unbelievable library of research, tools, ways to actually talk to employers about this, information about how much this is costing our healthcare system, how much this costs our employers, but more importantly, how difficult this is for people who live in bigger bodies. I have since that meeting with Dan, which I believe was in January-ish of 2021. Yep. So we're, almost 2 years in now, done just an enormous amount of research on my own and learned so much more about the intricacies of this particular issue. Obesity is a complex chronic disease, and we do need to treat it that way. We need to start looking at ways to remove the blame and the shame, the judgment, and so on and so forth, and how we can do that in each and every one of our own businesses and in our own lives. I recently read this book, which Lori has also read, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat. And Lori and I were discussing before we started here that even if just one person can shift their thinking on this, then we're moving in the right direction. Now, I know this is not a comfortable topic at all. It is extremely uncomfortable. And I have to say, I've spoken on a virtual stage quite a few times about this, and I'm still uncomfortable. It is still a difficult thing to discuss. And that has to do with a lot of my own bias and how I feel about my own body. And once we can start to move through this, then I think we can all start to make a change. So that is kind of the intro.
I want to talk, when you're talking about that book, and one of the items that really hit me was this war on obesity. Can you talk about that and the mindset that puts the average person in that entitlement?
Yes. Yeah. The woman that wrote the book identifies as a fat person, and I do use that term specifically. In her book, she actually says the term obese is derived from the Latin obesus, meaning having eaten oneself fat, which inherently blames fat people for their bodies. And this particular, she identifies as a fat activist. It made me rethink the word obesity even. Now, for purposes of today, we are going to use the term obesity. When we're looking at it through a clinical practice lens, that is the term that is used. But this just shows how complicated and difficult this actual subject is, that there are people out there who don't even want to use the word obese, and they want to use the word fat. And they are fat, just like they're tall, just like they're short, just like they have freckles, just like they have brown hair or blonde hair. It's just an identifier. And the war on people who live in bigger bodies is this entitlement that people who live in smaller bodies, or what Aubrey Gordon refers to as straight size, not regular size, but straight size, feel that they can impart judgment and blame on people who live in bigger bodies, particularly with this, how much it's costing us and how much it's costing the healthcare system. This woman is American, so their healthcare system is entirely different, but there is an entitlement out there for people who are straight-sized and feel that they can impose their views on somebody who isn't, down to somebody taking food out of this woman's grocery cart because it contained too much sugar, and it was a melon, like a cantaloupe or something. Does that answer your question?
How we as a society target children.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, like from a young age. And a lot of these folks have been at Weight Watchers since they were 10 years old, which is just a staggering thought. So I want Dan to give a little intro as well in terms of where he's coming from, and in particular the clinical practice guidelines that Dan has available to him, which is available to all of us, that help us put a different lens on what it is that we need to be talking about.
Well, thank you. And I should clarify that the subject matter expert is obviously going to be Nicole. I will view everything sort of from the lens of what does the evidence tell us, and what are the clinical pathways. As Nicole alluded to, we do have obesity clinical practice guidelines. And so we're having conversation around what is the proper terminology. I think we should allow ourselves some grace in terms of how do we begin to initiate this conversation, because it can be a challenging one. But for our purposes, they do have obesity clinical practice guidelines, and they're the same as they would have for any clinician or a healthcare provider in terms of how do I treat a particular chronic disease? What are the treatment algorithms? And what does the evidence suggest? So their obesity clinical practice guidelines were actually published in 2020. And to give you an idea around this subject and how prevalent and relevant it is, they were the most downloaded guidelines, or most downloaded article in CMAJ, which is the most prestigious and credible medical journal in Canada. So there's certainly a need and purpose behind it. And when we talk about the clinical practice guidelines, one important distinction that I just want to make is we are viewing this from the lens of a holistic approach. So diet and exercise remain foundational pieces in terms of anyone trying to find their healthy weight. That will always be part of the core, but they've also introduced some other elements such as cognitive behavior. Are there patterns in someone's life that perhaps they can address that will allow them to find what they consider to be their healthy weight? Anti-obesity medications are part of that equation, as is bariatric surgery. Mm-hmm. So how do we approach this from a holistic approach that provides all those resources, someone that is trying to find their healthy weight? And I think that's an important distinction, because we may have biases, or we may have viewpoints around what we feel is someone who is living with obesity. They may not feel so. They may be very comfortable with where they're at and who they are. And one important distinction from the clinical practice guidelines, it focuses on those individuals who are having their health impaired. And I think that becomes a really critical distinction. Not everyone that would appear to be in a bigger body is necessarily unhealthy. And I think we need to approach that appropriately. So how this came to be is we spoke to a number of engaged individuals like Nicole, benefit advisors, employers that wanted to do better by their employees, but didn't know how to start the conversation. So we realized rather than just talking in a very high level conceptual form, we might develop some agnostic tools that are available that sort of begin that journey. So we have a host of resources, as Nicole had mentioned. There's a modeling tool that's very much involved and comprehensive, that will provide a little bit of the financials around the impact it's having within a workplace based upon some of the associated comorbidities. So for instance, we know it has an impact in terms of people's mental health and wellness. We know it has an impact in terms of some of the other chronic diseases such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes. What are the economics behind that? And I don't want to draw this down to strictly an economic equation, because I think it's much more valid and important than that, especially when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's a component there where we can only speak to some of the financials and associated comorbidities and costs. We sort of put these programs together based upon three basic principles. One was, how can you engage an employer? So the tools within that are more geared towards a senior executive team or a human resources team that is wanting to do something for their employers as they go down that path of finding their healthy weight. We also put together some resources around how do you begin to develop an evidence-based obesity management support system. And again, those are all based upon clinical practice guidelines, which we are beholden to. And then there's finally some resources just that are aimed towards the employee, including how do we begin to initiate respectfully that conversation that can be a difficult one. So I don't want to belabor this point too terribly much, because there is an overwhelming amount of resources that are available. I'm happy to share those with you should you see fit. And Lori, perhaps that becomes a segue. If there are individuals wanting to learn more or see what might be possible by these resources, I'm happy to share them. But I think that would require a much more in-depth conversation, just to respect the content and respect the people that are participating today.
Yes, good. Thank you, Dan. And I have used that tool that Dan was speaking of, because as a benefits advisor, I also am trying to figure out how to broach this subject with my clients. It's not, again, it's an uncomfortable topic, and it's not easy to talk about, particularly if the person you are speaking to about it, an employer or a plan administrator, is in a bigger body. How do you actually bring this up? So what I've been doing, what Carla and myself, my partner down there, I give a wave, Carla, we have been looking into our plans to make sure that they have coverage for evidence-based anti-obesity medication. That's kind of step one that we've been looking at, to make sure that that barrier isn't there. At this point in 2022, we can't imagine not having coverage for depression medication, right? We can't imagine not having registered clinical counselors on the plan, right? Like that's, what kind of plan is that? That's just unimaginable. Dan informed me the other day, which I don't remember. Mike, maybe you remember this, but allegedly there were times way back when this wasn't covered on a plan. Because mental health was something that you needed to deal with on your own, or what have you. Mike, certainly jump in. Do you recall that?
Whether the actual medication class, not sure, but I do remember probably at least 20 years ago, like even some conversations about, say, disability. Like,
yes,
some people saying, like, can we exclude coverage for mental health claims, which actually you do have the option in the US, but that's more to do with the laws. And
Well,
but
and
just the fact that
I think that was prevalent, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, right up until almost 2010, we were still having those conversations about excluding mental health.
Still part of the conversation, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And Mike might recall, he was part of an esteemed panel that was discussing this, and it was described, mental wellness or mental health was described as a lack of mental fortitude. So
unbelievable. So here we are in 2022. Like, that is unimaginable. Yet we still have plans that do not have coverage for anti-obesity medication. I received a quote the other day from a company on a new piece of business that didn't have it. And so there are insurers and employers that, and I would say the employers are unwittingly choosing this. I don't think there's a lot of employers out there who would say, I don't want that on my plan, but it is something you have to elect to add, which again is unfathomable to me. We wouldn't elect to add medication for depression or cancer or heart disease, like we talked about in that very video. So that was step one for us. And then what we've also been working on are ways to find paths to inclusion for people with obesity. And Lori opened with this, like, who is missing in that DEI conversation? And it most certainly is people who live in bigger bodies. I mentioned a stat from the 2022 Benefits Canada Healthcare Survey about people with asthma and lung disease. People with obesity, 41% of them have experienced discrimination in the workplace, which I don't think is a surprise to anybody here. But what we have learned from that is members who have been discriminated against were twice as likely to experience high or extremely high stress. So 41% versus 21% of those not discriminated against. People who live in bigger bodies are in that 41%. And we all know what stress does. It is not good. So the lack of inclusion for people who live in bigger bodies, the lack of inclusion in society and in the workplace is not helping them at all. It is actually working against the whole thing. And I think this is where we can start to make little shifts in our behavior, in our actions, in our how we feel about people who live in bigger bodies.
Nicole, question for you there, and Dan, you might know this. I'm not looking for any insurer names, but surprised by that comment that maybe, like, as you get specs on a quote or what have you, because again, I don't advise. Would you say is there a normal, like, do most as a default not include it, or is it more just the rare one that doesn't include it?
Carla, you might be able to help me on this. I know there's one very large insurer in Canada that does include it on everyone. And then there's one very large insurer in Canada that does not. So it's,
So to your point, as the advisor, you have, yeah.
yeah.
would
yeah.
say
Well,
the
and I think it's a lot like fertility. Like there is a large insurer that includes it automatically. And then there are many insurers that unless you ask for it specifically, it is not going to be included. And I think we've had that as an industry. We've had it as part of our natural, and this is part of my growth, your natural way of laying out a benefit plan. We've been doing it for, I'm in my 24th year as well, excluding lifestyle drugs. Well, what's a lifestyle drug? And I always picked on erectile dysfunction, and with a little ha, that's on
Yeah.
me. That's on me. I am facilitating that bias that says the only people that would need an erectile dysfunction drug are those that are, in the bar every weekend. Like, what kind of thought process is that?
Yeah.
Right.
And if I may, you are right. I think a lot of plans will have exclusions towards that. It's difficult to quantify specifically, but it's felt like 1 in 4 will have some form of access to evidence-based anti-obesity medications. And I say some form because they might have certain restrictions or they might have annual caps. One point that I just want to raise, just from a biology perspective, again, foundationally, I think every plan would have access, or perhaps has access to a dietitian, or will have access to a kinesiologist that will help in terms of supporting movement and exercise and the like. Those remain foundational principles. But there's a biology element as well that really is complex for people living with obesity and wanting to help find their healthy weight. And that is they develop a certain set point. So when you diet and exercise more frequently, what ends up happening is your satiety or your fullness hormones actually will decrease. Your hunger hormones will actually increase. And you need to maintain and increase your energy expenditure in order to maintain and flatline that weight. And it's partly because we genetically are profiled to be hunters and gatherers. So we didn't know when we were going to get our next meal. And so consequently, the body becomes very good in terms of retaining that fat because they're in survival mode. And likewise, when they finally did have access to food, they want to take in as much high calorie food as they can to maintain that sustenance. So one, I think, critical variable that does come into play, and I'm sure you can all relate or have loved ones that have gone down that journey, is the guidelines will suggest it's also a relapsing condition because of this rebound effect. And I'm sure you've seen individuals or know of individuals that have lost weight, gained it back. The body's always going to want to try to go back to that predefined set point, is what it's called. The good news is we do know that there are certain therapies on the horizon that will rival bariatric surgery in terms of what they can do. And with that, you can see relapsing of type 2 diabetes. You can see improvements in cardiovascular outcomes. You can see improvements in a lot of the cost drivers that you may see on a benefit plan. So you don't need to have monumental changes, and we're really seeing quite a shift. I'd be remiss in suggesting that we did have access to therapies several years ago, and they really did come with some untoward side effects. There's been quite significant groundwork made now, not only in terms of the efficacy, which has improved greatly, but also in terms of the safety and the profiles. They're now cardiovascular protective, as an example. So it really has fundamentally shifted from times of old, to give some credit where credit's due.
And to walk away from the assumption too, Dan, that everybody who is in a larger body is naturally unhealthy.
Yes.
We wouldn't say that to a basketball player who's 7 feet tall. You must be naturally unhealthy. We wouldn't say that to a swimmer or a diver who has developed a bigger lung and they can go underwater. We wouldn't say, "Oh, that's unhealthy. You got to get rid of that big lung happening there. That's not cool." Shannon had a question, Nicole, with regards to making sure that the benefit programs and people have the availability. What are the particular drugs that we as advisors should be looking at to make sure that they are included for coverage? Is there a listing? Is it how do we know where to look?
Generally speaking, when you're adding it onto a plan, again, Mike and Mel may be able to address this. I believe it's whatever falls under the list. The key thing though, and Dan, you may have some input on this as well. The key thing is the maximum. The maximum needs to be high enough to make a difference. And these drugs are not cheap. There is definitely a cost to them. So putting a $500 a year maximum on is not a good idea. Like, why bother? So this is where we've had to, and I've had to work with some of the insurance companies even saying, you know what, I need to add this, but I don't want there to be any additional cost. You all know insurance companies, you either pay now or you pay later, right? If we can add this at no cost, we remove that barrier from adding it, but we have to make sure that the maximum is generous enough to cover the actual cost. So Dan, do you have some actual names of drugs or what the costs are?
Yeah, and I can sort of offer a little bit of clarity there. In Canada, in order to be classified as an anti-obesity medication, you need to demonstrate at least 5% weight loss. And increasingly, you need to demonstrate sustainability, which I think becomes a much more critical element, because we've all seen programs where they have significant caloric restrictions and people lose weight. They certainly are unable to sustain that. So for me, one of the critical pieces, are you able to sustain that weight loss? There's two categories really that are most prevalent right now in Canada. One actually works on a center that's more of an addiction center. And so it will help address some of those cravings. The other category of medications goes into a class called the GLP-1 class. And it actually has hormonal impacts. It's a naturally occurring hormone that typically is depressed in individuals that are living in larger bodies and may be classified as living with obesity. And that actually works on those satiety centers, and it works on those hunger hormones. And it actually has reductions in terms of cravings. So those are the two most prevalent classes. And I think on horizon, you're going to see some fairly interesting developments currently available in the States, and will be coming to Canada shortly, where you're into that 17% on average weight loss, and more importantly, sustained weight loss. So data going out to 2 years and some data going out to 3 years. And as I mentioned before, significant shifts as well around the safety profiles, where they now are cardiovascular protective, some of the medications. So you're dealing with a multifactorial and multi-organ benefits above and beyond just a number on a scale.
Ask a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So just Dan there, and I realize not everybody here is certainly BC, so this might be a bit more of a BC pharmacare centric kind of question, but what are you finding in terms of appetite from public payers, whether like the BC pharmacares or RAMQs, et cetera? Because certainly, you know, as much as, correct me if I'm wrong, Dan, but like Ozempic, for example, first for diabetes, but obviously showing very promising results in terms of the weight loss, and often those two are comorbidity entangled and so on. But on the public payer side, is there an appetite, or are the public payers saying, sorry, you get metformin or whatever it is, and good luck?
Yeah, those conversations do continue. So as you mentioned, on the public side, the GLP-1s are available for type 2 diabetes, and have shown incredible progress. If you just take a look at the number of individuals, it offers promise for those individuals. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's an element of continuity in terms of their care, because they have lost weight, and that helps them down that journey of finding a healthier lifestyle. In terms of the obesity conversations, we are having those conversations at a political level with governments. They realize that they need to do something about it. The question just becomes, where do we start? Because it represents a significant part of the population, and they have not typically addressed it currently, but they are facing the long-term impacts of obesity in the healthcare system. So I'll give you an example. In Alberta, what we've been able to identify using their own data sets is if someone has a comorbidity, so as an example, type 2 diabetes, or is living with cardiovascular disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, individuals that just have those conditions versus individuals that have those conditions and obesity, there's a significant delta in terms of costs. So the obesity is adding additional costs to the system. So now we're trying to have the conversation just saying, where does it make most sense? And one intriguing thing we talk about stigma biases. One intriguing element that I found incredibly interesting is that when people go through medical school, they don't actually have any counseling guidance when it comes to obesity. So when you think of the population, 25% of the population of Canadians may be technically classified as living with obesity. It certainly represents a fairly significant disconnect. And again, beginning to broach that subject from a policy perspective and from medical education perspective, but it does speak around some of the gaps. I don't know if I answered your question there, Mike, but yeah, we are indeed trying to have those conversations with governments. The question is just now, I had a conversation just recently in Alberta, and I said, this is something that we need to do. Just where do we begin to start?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And I think, Nicole, you sounded earlier more in the context of private plans, but pay me now or pay me later. But that conversation is equally important in
Absolutely.
the public system. And for what it's worth, Dan, too, again, I'm not going to put any companies on pedestals, but just I was prepping for a presentation and chatting with the senior pharmacist at one of the large insurers, and he had very good things to say about the GLP-1s and just the promising, understanding the cost difference, but still, and I think it's that sort of enlightened view of, even though we as a private payer are responsible for this piece, as a society, the aspects of sort of downstream impacts and health system and otherwise. So, but it was, I was like, oh, okay, good to hear.
I think Melanie succinctly says, as a mom, as people, how do we start spreading that message?
Yeah.
Lisa had said, how do we start that message without looking like we're trying to shame people? And then to Shannon's point, now we've shit the bed or shift the bed prior to even getting the conversation going. So how to do that? I'm going to recommend, can you hold that book up again, Nicole? I'm
Yes.
absolutely going to recommend as a first takeaway, read this book. Just read that book. It will shift. It's not a preachy book at all.
No.
It's a real book and from a real perspective. And if other people, recommend that book. But what are some takeaways that we can, and I should prep by saying this is our first of a series. We're going to be going into the new year and we're going to have a set timeline where we are going to delve into each of the various topics as it applies to straight talk about obesity and shifting the conversation and the bias. So watch for those. This is just the opener. But I want to leave everybody, Nicole, with a takeaway. What can they do today to share the message out? Where can it start today?
I think the key thing here is we don't have all the answers, and what we're doing right now is not necessarily even perfect. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm still uncomfortable talking about this, even though I've done such a deep dive. It's difficult. So I don't always, again, we don't have the answers. We're trying to do our best. I think the key thing is let's have a look at our own bias first. And that includes reading these kinds of books. And when you see somebody in a bigger body, try not to have judgment that it's their fault. Understand that there are so many factors involved: genetics, hormones, environmental factors, behavioral factors. The stress that they're under is immense. Start with your own bias, and then I think you can start to have these conversations with people. And say, again, we wouldn't think about not having meds for depression on our benefit plan. Why do we not have meds for anti-obesity on our plan? Let's just start the conversation there.
I agree. A great last word. Dan, over to you.
Thank you again for being part of this conversation. I think it's been said best. I think we just need to better understand that people living with obesity are likely going through struggles. There's a whole number of factors that are involved through that process. So how do we begin to find those individuals whose health is being impaired and want to find what they consider to be a healthy weight? I think that becomes a critical distinction. And oftentimes it's are they ready for change? People typically that are struggling with what they consider to be weight issues have tried numerous things. They're aware that they likely are living in a bigger body and want to do better. So try not to pass judgment, and let's encourage each other. How can we support those individuals that are wanting to find their healthy weight? I think that becomes really the critical focus, and where we alone can make a big difference.
Excellent. I thank everybody for joining in today. This is the start of an important series of conversations that we're going to continue to have. I'm looking forward to the next one, Nicole. I truly am. Thank you everybody for coming out today. Thank you for being brave. First and foremost, we don't say that very often on this show because we do tend to keep it fairly light and bouncy. But thanks for being brave today. Thanks for engaging, and let's continue the conversation. Have yourselves a great week. Thank you.